Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking an incredible anatomical zoom right into the human respiratory system. I mean, we breathe in and out thousands upon thousands of times a day, mostly without ever giving it a second thought, right? But today, we aren't just looking at the lungs themselves. We're looking at the microscopic, invisible shield that actually makes all of those breaths possible.
So what protects your lungs every time you take a breath? Now, you might be thinking of the hard outer shell of the ribcage. But actually, there's a delicate, unseen, continuous barrier working tirelessly deep inside your chest to keep your lungs safe and functioning properly.
The answer is the pleura. Okay, let's dive into this. The pleura is a thin protective membrane that surrounds and protects the lungs. You can kind of think of it as a silent, invisible wrapping that lines your most vital respiratory organs. Without this protective tissue, your lungs would literally be incredibly vulnerable.
Now, the pleura isn't just one single, simple sheet. It actually comes in two distinct types that you really need to be familiar with. First up, we've got the visceral pleura. This layer is essentially shrink-wrapped right onto the surface of the lungs, and it dips deep into the interlobar fissures, which are just the grooves between the lobes of your lungs. Contrasting that is the parietal pleura, which lines the outer boundaries. It covers the entire surface of the diaphragm at the base and coats the inside of the thoracic cavity. So you basically have one layer hugging the lungs tightly and another layer coating the outer walls around them.
Because we have these two separate layers of protective tissue facing each other, a tiny gap is naturally created between them. This is known as the pleural space, or sometimes the pleural cavity, and it's exactly what it sounds like, the space right in between the visceral and parietal pleura. While it is incredibly tiny, this critical space is filled with a small amount of lubricating fluid, and it acts like a vacuum, creating a negative pressure environment. This vacuum effect is what actually keeps your lungs pulled open and allows for smooth, frictionless movement when you breathe. But, because it's such a delicate environment reliant on that exact pressure, it's also exactly where things can go terribly wrong.
When our invisible shield becomes compromised, we run into medical trouble known as pleural disease. Now, this isn't just one specific illness. Rather, it's a broad medical term used to describe literally any disorder or condition that affects this pleural membrane. If any issue impacts the pleura, or that tiny pleural space we just talked about, well, it falls under this wide classification.
So how many major ways can things go wrong inside that tiny cavity? Well, primarily two. There are two main diseases that occur right here in the pleural space. By getting a handle on these two primary culprits, we can better understand how to protect our respiratory health. Let's compare and contrast exactly what they are.
We're going to start with condition 1, which is pleural effusion. I actually like to think of this one simply as the fluid problem. A pleural effusion is a serious respiratory condition characterized by an abnormal accumulation of fluid inside that tiny pleural space. Instead of a smooth, healthy vacuum environment between the lung and the chest wall, excess fluid starts to build up, pool, and basically take up space where it absolutely shouldn't be.
So, you might be wondering, where is all this fluid coming from? While several varying medical conditions can trigger this abnormal fluid buildup, what's really interesting about this slide is that congestive heart failure is actually the most common cause. It perfectly highlights how deeply interconnected our body systems truly are, A problem that starts in the heart can directly end up flooding the protective shield of the lungs. Wild, right?
Now let's pivot sharply. Condition 2 is a pneumothorax, which we can just call the air problem. Unlike the gradual pooling of fluid we just saw, a pneumothorax is a respiratory condition that occurs when air suddenly leaks into the pleural space of the thoracic region. Air gets trapped between the lung and the chest wall, and it creates a highly dangerous, extremely sudden medical situation.
Let's walk through exactly how dangerous this chain reaction is, step by step. First, that rogue air leak occurs in the pleural space. Second, the internal pressure is immediately altered. So the absolutely crucial point here is the sudden loss of normal negative pressure. Remember that vacuum effect we talked about earlier? Yeah, your lungs rely on that very specific internal pressure dynamic to stay inflated and pulled open against the chest wall. When outside air forces its way into the pleural space, it completely destroys that balance. And third, this altered pressure pushes heavily against the outside of the lung, ultimately resulting in a collapsed lung.
But how exactly does this devastating air leak happen in the first place? Well, the causes of a pneumothorax generally fall into two main categories. It can result from an open injury to the chest wall, so think of a direct physical trauma that literally punctures your invisible shield from the outside, or alternatively, it can be a non-traumatic event. In these kind of frustrating non-traumatic cases, the exact cause is completely unknown, but the sudden air leak and the resulting lung collapse happen nonetheless.
Whether a patient is facing the fluid problem of a pleural effusion or the dangerous air problem of a pneumothorax, how do medical professionals actually fix it? Well, treatment depends entirely on the specific signs and symptoms of the patient. There's absolutely no one-size-fits-all cure here. Resolving these really complex internal issues is highly individualized to how the patient presents medically at that exact moment.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? I mean, how delicate is our respiratory system if a tiny shift in fluid or air pressure can literally collapse our most vital organs? It's just astonishing how this incredibly thin membrane, the pleura, dictates so much of our health and our daily survival. I highly encourage you to explore further medical guides if you want to dive deeper into the specific treatments for these unique conditions. But until then, take a moment to appreciate that invisible shield inside your chest. And as always, breathe easy, my friends.